Ladies and gentlemen, it's a deep and profound truth about humanity. Every one of us longs for independence. It's a universal drive ingrained in our very nature. We feel it from an early age, the desire to stand on our own 2 feet, to forge our path, to make decisions for ourselves. But what does it truly mean? Why do we have this inner longing for freedom, for self-reliance, for control? And how does this yearning shape our lives, our choices, and our relationship with God? Ladies and gentlemen, the drive for independence is something we must understand in its fullness if we are to see our lives in a clearer, more purposeful light. We're not just talking about physical independence, though that's often where it starts. We're talking about emotional, mental, and spiritual independence as well. The root of this desire for independence can often be traced back to the very beginning of our story. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were placed in a perfect environment where they lacked nothing. God gave them everything they needed: His presence, the bounty of the earth, and the companionship of one another. And yet, it wasn't enough. They were given one command: do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It was simple. But the desire for more, the desire to be independent from God's perfect design, led them to disobey. They wanted to be like God, to have the knowledge and power to make decisions on their own, apart from His guidance. This was the first act of independence, and it changed everything. From that moment, humanity began to wrestle with this tension: the desire for independence from God versus the call to depend on Him. This is a struggle that is carried on through the ages, affecting each one of us in different ways. We too long for autonomy. We want to make our own choices. We want to be in control. We want to be free from limitations, from authority, from anything that tells us what to do. And yet, deep inside, we know there's a cost to that independence. It's a cost that we often feel in the form of anxiety, confusion, and loneliness. Let's consider for a moment what true independence really is. Is it about having the power to do whatever we want, whenever we want? Is it about standing alone without needing anyone or anything? Is it about being self-sufficient, not relying on anyone else? The world tells us that this is the pinnacle of success, the ultimate goal. We see it all around us people, striving to break free from what they perceive as limitations, seeking to carve out their own path, to build their own empire. But as we search for independence, we must ask ourselves, are we truly free? Or are we simply becoming slaves to our own desires, to the pressures of society, to the demands of our own self-made standard? When we chase independence in this way, we can become overwhelmed by the need to constantly perform, to prove ourselves, to hold everything together. It's exhausting. In the world's eyes, independence means freedom. But in the eyes of God, it's different. True independence, according to God's design, is not about breaking free from everything and everyone. It's about submitting to the right things. It's about surrendering our will to the one who knows us best, who made us, who loves us. The more we try to live independently of God, the more we find ourselves in bondage to our own limitations. The more we try to control our own destiny, the more we find ourselves out of control. True freedom comes when we release our grip and trust God to lead us. This is why the Apostle Paul, a man who knew a great deal about independence, could say, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. This wasn't the declaration of a man who was relying on his own strength. This was the confession of a man who understood that true independence wasn't about relying on himself, but about depending fully on Christ. It was through his dependence on Christ that he found the strength, the peace, and the purpose that he sought. His sense of independence was wrapped up in his complete surrender to God. We must come to understand that our drive for independence, when pursued without understanding, can lead us down a dangerous path. We were not created to live outside of God's will. Independence, when left unchecked, leads to isolation. It leads to self-reliance that becomes self-centeredness, and self-centeredness separates us from the community, from God, and from the true fulfillment that only comes through connection and dependence. This doesn't mean that we should throw away all ambition or avoid taking responsibility for our life. The drive to stand on our own feet, to provide for ourselves, and to pursue our goals is part of the design that God has placed in us. It's a reflection of His image in us. He is a God who works, who creates, and who governs. We are meant to reflect that in our lives. But there's a balance, a place where we must recognize that while we can achieve much, we cannot achieve everything on our own. We are dependent on God for every breath, every step, every decision. This is where the tension lies. How do we live as independent individuals while still recognizing our dependence on God? It begins with understanding that independence in the biblical sense is not the absence of dependence, it's the proper ordering of it. Independence in this world is about asserting control over everything. But biblical independence is about placing God at the center of everything and recognizing that we are weak, but He is strong. We are called to depend on God not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. The wise person knows that he or she cannot navigate life's complexities alone. The wise person understands that real freedom comes through surrender to God's will, to His plan, to His purpose. It's only through that surrender that we can experience the peace and joy that true independence offers. It's easy to become disillusioned by the world's view of independence. Society tells us to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, to carve out our own destiny, to rely on no one but ourselves. But God calls us to something different. He calls us to be dependent on Him, to trust in His provision, to walk in His way. And in doing so, we find the freedom that the world cannot offer. This is where the beauty of God's design for independence becomes clear. It's not about breaking free from all authority, but about submitting to the right authority. It's not about removing all dependence, but about directing our dependence to the one who knows best. It's about recognizing that in our weakness, God's strength is made perfect. When we lay down our drive for independence and choose instead to depend on Him, we find the peace and rest that we've been searching for all along. So what does this mean for us practically? It means surrendering our plans, our dreams, our desires to God. It means trusting Him with our future, with our relationships, with our careers, with our families. It means recognizing that true independence isn't about being in control, but about letting go and allowing God to lead. This doesn't mean that we become passive or inactive. It doesn't mean we stop pursuing our goals or working hard to achieve what we feel called to do. It means that we recognize the limits of our own strength and that we place our trust in the one who is limitless. It means that we approach every area of our lives with the understanding that God is at the center and that He has the ultimate say in how things unfold. As we walk this journey of life, we will face many opportunities to assert our independence. We will be tempted to go our own way, to follow our own desires, to reject God's plan. But in those moments, let's remember that true freedom comes not in independence from God, but in dependence on Him. True independence is not about living outside His will, but about living within it. When we choose to live in dependence on God, we find that our lives are filled with peace, with purpose, and with power. We no longer have to carry the heavy burden of self-reliance. We no longer have to fear the future because we know that God is with us, leading us, guiding us every step of the way. And in that dependence, we find a freedom that the world cannot understand, a freedom that comes from knowing that we are not in control, but that God is. The speech emphasizes that while humans naturally crave independence, true freedom and fulfillment are found not in self-reliance, but in surrendering to God. Biblical independence is about aligning with God's will, recognizing our limits, and trusting in His strength to guide us through life. The drive for independence should not lead to isolation or self-centeredness, but rather it should be balanced by recognizing that we were created to depend on God. True independence is not about rejecting authority or control, but about submitting to the right authority God, allowing His guidance to lead us to genuine peace, purpose, and freedom. True independence is something that most people crave, but few fully understand. From a young age, we are taught to stand on our own, to make our own decisions, to not rely on anyone else. This desire to be independent is ingrained in us by society, family, and our own inner drive for self-sufficiency. We are often told that independence is the pinnacle of success, that once we are free from reliance on others, we will have truly made it. But as we pursue this goal, we must ask ourselves a critical question. What does true independence really look like? Is it simply about being able to do whatever we want, whenever we want? Or is it about something deeper, something more aligned with our true purpose? The world often presents independence as being synonymous with freedom. The idea is that if we can free ourselves from dependence on others, from rules, from constraints, then we will finally be free to live as we wish. But this view of independence can be misguided because it overlooks the reality that true freedom is not the absence of all dependence. It is the ability to depend on the right things, the right people, and most importantly, the right source of strength. And for the Christian, the ultimate source of true freedom is found in dependence on God. The root of humanity's desire for independence can be traced back to the very beginning of our story. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were placed in a perfect environment. They had everything they needed: God's presence, the beauty of creation, the abundance of the earth, and the companionship of one another. But despite all this, there was one thing they lacked: autonomy over their choices. God, in His wisdom, gave them one simple command: do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It was a command that carried with it the invitation to trust in God's perfect plan for their lives. But rather than trust, they desired independence from God. They wanted to be like Him, to have the knowledge and power to make decisions apart from His guidance. This desire for autonomy led them to disobey God, to take matters into their own hands, and the consequences of that choice were devastating. From that moment on, the tension between dependence and independence has been woven into the fabric of the human experience. It's a tension that we feel every day. On one hand, we yearn for the freedom to make our own decisions, to shape our own destiny, and to control our own life. On the other hand, we know that life is full of challenges, uncertainties, and difficulties, things we cannot control on our own. We are faced with the reality that no matter how much we strive for self-sufficiency, there will always be things beyond our control. And in those moments of uncertainty, we often realize that we are not as independent as we once thought. In the world's eyes, independence is seen as a mark of strength and success. Those who can stand on their own, who can make their own way without needing anyone else, are often held up as examples of achievement. We are told that we must pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, that we must rely on no one but ourselves if we want to succeed. But this message, while motivating, can be dangerous. It promotes the idea that independence is the ultimate goal, that we must break free from all forms of dependence to truly be free. But the reality is that this kind of independence can lead to isolation, loneliness, and burnout. We can become so focused on proving our self-sufficiency that we forget we were never meant to live in isolation. We were created for relationship with God and with others. We were made to be dependent not on our own strength, but on the strength of the one who created us. True independence, according to God's design, is not about rejecting all forms of dependence. It is about recognizing the proper order of dependence. We were created to depend on God, to acknowledge that He is the source of our strength, our wisdom, and our purpose. True independence is not about breaking free from all authority, but submitting to the ultimate authority of God. It is not about doing everything on our own, but about acknowledging that we are not capable of living this life on our own, and that we need God's help every step of the way. Jesus himself modeled this kind of dependence. He who was fully God humbled himself to live as a man, and in doing so, he demonstrated perfect dependence on his heavenly Father. Throughout his life, Jesus relied on the Father for guidance, for strength, and for purpose. Even in the Garden of Gethsemane, as he faced the greatest trial of his life, Jesus prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." He understood that true freedom and true strength come not from asserting one's own will, but from surrendering to God's will. He showed us that the way to true independence is not through self-reliance, but through perfect dependence on God. This is the paradox of the Christian life. The more we depend on God, the more independent we become in the truest sense of the word. When we place our trust in God, when we surrender our will to Him, we experience a freedom that the world cannot offer. This freedom is not freedom from dependence. It is freedom to depend on the one who is completely trustworthy, completely faithful, and completely able to meet our every need. It's important to understand that dependence on God does not mean passivity. It does not mean sitting back and waiting for God to do everything for us. God has called us to be active participants in His plan, to use the gifts and abilities He has given us to serve others and to fulfill the purposes He has for our life. But it does mean that we acknowledge that apart from God, we can do nothing. Jesus said, "Apart from me, you can do nothing." This is not a statement of defeat, but a statement of reality. We were never meant to live independent of God. We were created to live in partnership with Him, to rely on His wisdom, His strength, and His guidance. This partnership with God doesn't negate our personal responsibility or our ability to make choices. It simply means that we recognize that we are not self-sufficient, and we choose to place our trust in the one who is. When we do this, we find that God is more than able to equip us for the challenges we face. We find that His strength is made perfect in our weakness, and that He provides everything we need to live the life He has called us to live. True independence is not found in doing everything on our own, but in acknowledging that we are dependent on God and trusting Him to provide the wisdom, strength, and resources we need to fulfill His purpose. This truth has profound implications for our lives. It changes the way we approach our daily tasks, our relationships, and our future. It reminds us that we are not in control of everything and that we don't have to be. We are free to trust God with our lives, knowing that He has a plan for us and that He is with us every step of the way. When we embrace this dependence on God, we can rest in His provision and experience the peace that comes from knowing that He is in control. As we seek to live lives of true independence, we must remember that the path to freedom is not through self-sufficiency, but through surrender. True independence is not about being free from all dependence, but about depending on the right source, the one who created us, loves us, and has a perfect plan for our life. When we live in this kind of dependence on God, we find that we are not bound by the limitations of our own strength, but are empowered by the limitless power of God. This is the kind of independence that leads to true freedom, peace, and purpose. Living in the tension between self-sufficiency and surrender is a challenge that every human faces, and it is one of the central struggles of the Christian life. On one hand, we are encouraged by the world to be independent, to forge our own way, to stand on our own feet, to take control of our future. This drive for independence is often seen as a sign of strength and success. However, the Christian message invites us to a different understanding, one where surrender does not mean weakness, but rather wisdom. The call to live in surrender to God is not about abandoning responsibility or striving for less. It is about finding a proper balance where dependence on God is central to our strength and purpose. The concept of surrender can be difficult to grasp in a world that celebrates independence. We are told from an early age to be self-reliant, to build our own path, to make decisions without relying on anyone else. In fact, the idea of surrender is often viewed as a form of defeat or submission, something to be avoided at all costs. But the Christian faith calls us to a life of surrender, not to the whims of others, but to the will of God. This type of surrender is not a passive retreat from life or responsibility, but an active choice to place ourselves under the guidance of a loving and all-knowing Creator. Surrendering to God doesn't mean that we lose our individuality or abandon our desires. On the contrary, surrender in the Christian context is about submitting our will to God's will, which ultimately leads us to become the people we were always meant to be. It's about acknowledging that we are not in control of everything and that God's way is infinitely better than any path we could carve for ourselves. It is a radical shift from the world's perspective, where independence is equated with success and surrender is seen as failure. In the kingdom of God, however, surrender leads to victory, peace, and freedom. When we choose to surrender to God, we are choosing to acknowledge that we cannot navigate life alone. We are not made to live in isolation apart from the guidance and wisdom of the Creator. From the very beginning of creation, we see that God designed us for relationship with Him and with one another. The story of Adam and Eve highlights this truth. Despite living in a perfect garden, they chose independence over God's direction, and the consequences of their decision were catastrophic. The desire for self-rule, the hunger for autonomy outside of God's plan, led them into sin, separation, and suffering. This narrative reflects the human tendency to want to control our own lives, to believe that we can manage everything on our own. We tend to want to hold the reins of our future, to be the architects of our own success, and to rely on our own wisdom and strength. But when we do this, we inevitably come to a place of limitation. No matter how hard we try to control every aspect of our lives, there will always be things beyond our reach. Our health, the decisions of others, the passage of time, these are all things that we cannot dictate. And this is where surrender comes in. It is an acknowledgement that while we may have the power to make choices, we do not have the power to control everything that happens in our life. Living in surrender to God doesn't diminish our responsibility or make us passive participants in life. Rather, it empowers us to make decisions, to act with confidence, and to engage in the world around us, knowing that we are not doing so on our own. It means acknowledging that while we are responsible for our actions, our wisdom and strength come from God. Our dependence on God is not an excuse for laziness, but a recognition that we need His guidance and empowerment every step of the way. Surrendering to God also means trusting His plan for our lives, even when it doesn't align with our own desires or expectations. It means relinquishing our desire for control and opening ourselves up to the possibility that God's will is better than anything we could come up with on our own. This kind of surrender involves faith, the faith that God knows what is best for us, even when we don't fully understand what He is doing. It requires humility to acknowledge that our understanding is limited, but God's understanding is infinite. We may not always see the bigger picture, but we can trust that God is working all things together for our good. This surrender is not a one-time act, but a continual process of choosing to place our trust in God every day. It's easy to surrender to God when things are going well, when everything is aligned with our desires, and when we can see the outcome clearly. But it's much harder to surrender when life doesn't make sense, when things are difficult, or when God's plan is not what we expected. Yet, this is where true faith is tested and refined. When we choose to surrender in these difficult moments, we demonstrate that our trust in God is not based on our circumstances, but on His character. We are choosing to believe that even in the midst of hardship, God is still good, and He is still in control. One of the key aspects of surrender is letting go of our need for perfection. We often feel the pressure to be flawless, to succeed in every area of life, and to present an image of control and competence. This desire for perfection can drive us to exhaustion as we strive to meet impossible standards, both our own and others. But surrendering to God allows us to release this pressure and to embrace the reality that we are not perfect. We do not have to have all the answers, and we do not have to be in control of everything. We can rest in the knowledge that God is sovereign and that He is working in our lives, even in the areas where we are weak or struggling. When we choose to surrender, we are also choosing to embrace the mystery of God's will. There are times when we may not understand why things happen the way they do. We may not see the purpose in our suffering or the reason behind certain events, but surrender allows us to trust God with the unknown. We may not have all the answers, but we can trust that God is always working for our good and for His glory. This kind of trust is not naive or blind. It is a trust that is rooted in our understanding of God's nature and character. God is good and He is faithful, and even when we do not understand, we can trust that He knows what He is doing. Surrender is also a key to finding peace. So often we strive and struggle, trying to control every aspect of our lives, trying to fix things and make them right. But this constant striving can leave us feeling anxious, overwhelmed, and exhausted. When we surrender to God, we release the burden of trying to do everything on our own. We find rest in His presence, knowing that He is in control and that we can trust Him with the outcome. This peace that comes from surrender is not based on our circumstances, but on the unchanging truth that God is faithful and He will never leave us or forsake us. Ultimately, living in surrender is about finding freedom. It is freedom from the pressure to be perfect, from the need to control everything, and from the fear of the unknown. It is the freedom that comes from knowing that God is in control and that we can trust Him with our lives. It is the freedom to step out in faith, to pursue God's purpose for our lives, and to live without fear or anxiety. This kind of freedom is not found in independence from God, but in complete dependence on Him. When we surrender our lives to God, we find that we are free to live the life He has called us to live on, of peace, purpose, and joy. Living in surrender is not always easy, but it is always worth it. It is the path that leads to true freedom, true peace, and true fulfillment. When we surrender our will to God, we open ourselves up to the incredible work He wants to do in and through us. We no longer have to strive to prove ourselves, to manage everything, or to make everything perfect. We can rest in the fact that God is at work and that He is guiding us every step of the way. And in this surrender, we find the life that we were always meant to live.